After the first shock of the courtroom, what people never saw was how normal my life looked on paper. Mortgage statements stacked next to grocery receipts, insurance premiums auto-drafted every month, a car note that quietly pulled money from my account like clockwork, and credit card balances that told a story no one in that courtroom cared to read carefully. Because in America, people don't just argue about custody. They argue about who looks like they can afford stability. The young white American woman, late 20s to mid-30s, had lived inside that system long before she ever stood in front of a judge. She wasn't confused about money the way they assumed. She understood it in a different way, through statements, due dates, payment cycles, and ownership lines printed in small font at the bottom of legal pages. She knew what it meant when a mortgage was paid from one account, but the title stayed in another name. She knew what it meant when insurance policies listed beneficiaries that didn't match emotional expectations. And she knew, most of all, that cash flow always reveals who is actually carrying responsibility, regardless of who speaks the loudest in a courtroom. What made her appear weak to others was not ignorance. It was silence. She didn't perform financial confidence. She tracked it, quietly, carefully, like someone reading a language others only speak when they're in trouble. The white American billionaire man, late 50s to 70s, remained seated in the background of this entire process like a constant variable no one could fully interpret. He didn't intervene in conversations. He didn't correct anyone. He simply observed the structure underneath the emotion. He had seen this pattern before, where people confuse spending power with ownership and monthly payments with control. To him, the courtroom wasn't a battlefield. It was a balance sheet that had finally been forced into public view. Outside the courtroom, life continued in the same financial rhythm it always had. Bills didn't pause for legal arguments. The house still required maintenance payments. Utilities still auto-drafted. School expenses still came through email notifications. And every transaction carried a trace of who was responsible versus who was simply associated. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Because inside the home we once shared, my husband's name appeared on many accounts, but not on every layer of responsibility. And in financial systems like this, what matters isn't who looks connected. It's who is legally and consistently recorded as the point of obligation. I had learned that lesson not through theory, but through repetition. Every time a bill was paid, I looked at where the money originated. Every time a document was signed, I checked what role it assigned. Every time a system updated, I noticed who was added and who was never officially removed. That is what people misunderstand about financial control inside families. It rarely looks like control. It looks like convenience, shared access, default settings, assumptions no one questions until something breaks. And in my case, nothing had broken yet. Not visibly, not legally, but something had been building underneath it all, stored in records the school kept, in notes the nurse had written, in patterns of responsibility no one had bothered to connect together until now. Because while the courtroom focused on arguments, the real system was still compiling data elsewhere. Quietly, indifferently, accurately. The school nurse file. Still sealed. Still waiting. Still holding the kind of documented truth that doesn't care about reputation, tone of voice, or confidence in front of a judge. And as I sat there holding it, I realized something simple but irreversible. The entire case wasn't going to be decided by who sounded right. It was going to be decided by what had already been recorded. In courtrooms like this, people always believe they already understand what they are seeing. They assume silence means weakness. They assume confidence means truth. They assume whoever speaks with the most certainty must also own the reality they are describing. But that is where most financial misunderstandings begin, inside assumptions that were never questioned. The young white American woman, late 20s to mid-30s, had been misread long before she ever entered this courtroom. People mistook her silence for submission. They mistook her modest lifestyle for financial dependence. They mistook the absence of public display for the absence of ownership. But none of those assumptions matched the system she had been quietly tracking for years, systems built on documentation, not perception. This is where the false beliefs of most people in the room become dangerous. They confuse looking rich with owning assets. They confuse control with appearance. They confuse monthly payments with real ownership. And perhaps most importantly, they confuse loud accusations with quiet documents. Her husband understood appearance. He understood how to present stability, how to frame financial responsibility in a way that sounded like control. He spoke in court like someone managing a portfolio of narratives, carefully emphasizing what he paid for, what he handled, what he maintained. To the untrained ear, that sounded like ownership. But payments are not ownership. Payments are obligations. And obligations do not always equal rights. That is the contradiction most people never see. Someone can pay for a home without owning the full legal structure of it. Someone can support a household without holding the final authority over the documentation that defines responsibility. Someone can speak confidently about control while the actual records tell a different story entirely. The white American billionaire man, late 50s to 70s, remained in the background observing this dynamic like he was watching a familiar system repeat itself. In his world, wealth was never measured by what people claimed. It was measured by what could be verified without debate. He had seen too many cases where emotional certainty collapsed the moment paperwork was introduced. Because emotion always speaks first in human conflict. But documentation always speaks last and louder. Inside this courtroom, that tension was building quietly. On one side, there were loud narratives. Who provided? Who led? Who took responsibility? On the other side, there were quiet records, school logs, medical notes, financial traces, and a sealed file that no one had fully opened yet. And that is where the real question begins, not for the courtroom, but for anyone watching this unfold. How often do people mistake emotional intensity for financial truth? How often do we assume the person speaking most confidently is the one with the strongest claim? How often do we confuse what looks stable with what is actually documented? Because in financial systems, especially those tied to family, custody, and responsibility, the truth is rarely loud. It is recorded. It is stored. It is time-stamped in places most people never think to check. And in this case, all of that structure pointed towards something still unopened, still unexamined, still waiting inside a single file that had been quietly built over time without anyone in this room fully appreciating its weight. The school nurse file. Not emotional, not speculative, not interpretive, just recorded reality, waiting for the moment it would finally override everything said in its absence. And that moment was getting closer than anyone realized. What most people in that courtroom never understood is that financial conflict is never just about who feels right. It is about what the system recognizes as real. And in the system, reality is not emotional. It is structural. The young white American woman, late 20s to mid-30s, had learned to see money the way most people never do, not as lifestyle, but as movement. Money moves in patterns. Income comes in, obligations go out, and what remains is either protection or vulnerability. That difference is what separates assets from liabilities. An asset is anything that either protects your financial position or brings money back into your control over time. A liability is anything that quietly pulls money out of your control without strengthening your position. And most families never notice the difference until the pressure becomes legal. In real life, liabilities don't look dangerous. They look normal. Mortgage payments, car notes, insurance premiums, credit card balances. They feel like stability because they are familiar. But familiarity is not the same as ownership. Sometimes, what looks like control is just a recurring withdrawal system that never stops extracting value. That is where cash flow becomes the invisible force in every relationship like this. Cash flow is not just income. It is the direction money moves when no one is arguing. It is the system operating quietly in the background while people focus on emotions in the foreground. Cash flow is what reveals who is actually carrying responsibility, regardless of who speaks the loudest in court. And none of that works without documentation, because paper is what turns emotion into structure. Payment records show who consistently carried financial responsibility. Deeds show who legally holds ownership, not just residence. Bank statements show where money actually originated and where it ended. Titles show legal authority, not emotional expectation. Prenups define boundaries long before conflict begins. Camera footage and logs remove interpretation entirely and replace it with timestamps. And custody files, or in this case, the school nurse file, turn everyday life into recorded accountability. That is the part most people miss. Documentation is not passive. It is protective. It is the wall between assumption and reality. It is the reason emotional arguments eventually collapse under structured review. The white American billionaire man, late 50s to 70s, understood this better than anyone in the room. He wasn't impressed by arguments or performances. He watched systems. Because systems always reveal the truth eventually, even when people try to delay it with confidence or social pressure. In his experience, the loudest voices in a courtroom were rarely the most financially accurate ones. The quietest documents usually carried the final authority. My husband, however, still believed that visibility meant control. He believed that because he handled payments, because his name appeared on certain accounts, because he managed outward expenses, that he also controlled the underlying structure. But managing cash flow is not the same as owning the framework that defines responsibility. And that gap between perception and structure is where every financial misunderstanding inside families eventually breaks open. Because you can emotionally argue ownership all day, but you cannot emotionally override documentation once it enters a legal system. That is why I kept thinking about the file sitting in my hands. The school nurse file. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was emotional, but because it represented something far more dangerous to false narratives: consistent, recorded, third-party documentation of responsibility over time. And in systems like this, time-stamped records always matter more than spoken memory. The problem was simple. No one in that courtroom had fully opened it yet, but someone was about to. By the time the folder was placed on the table, the atmosphere in the courtroom had already shifted in a way no one could immediately explain. Like the air itself had become heavier once evidence stopped being abstract and started becoming physical. The young white American woman, late 20s to mid-30s, sat still as multiple layers of documentation began to surface one by one. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but with the quiet inevitability of systems finally revealing what had always been recorded underneath the noise. Inside the folder was the deed first, clean, official, unmistakable. Not a story, not a claim. A property deed with structured legal formatting that didn't care about tone or interpretation. Next to it, a bank statement appeared, with one line subtly circled in red ink, highlighting a recurring financial pattern that no argument could reinterpret. Then came a printed sequence of digital logs, payment histories that showed consistency, timing, and responsibility distribution over time. No one spoke yet, because documents have a way of forcing silence before they are even fully understood. A phone was placed gently beside the folder next. On its screen, a short video. Not emotional, not edited. Just raw, time-stamped footage connected to custody routines, school drop-offs, and care moments that had been quietly recorded without anyone treating them as legally significant at the time. On the lawyer's table nearby, a custody file sat partially open, its pages marked with tabs that indicated structure rather than opinion. School reports, medical entries, attendance logs. And somewhere within that system, the school nurse file that had been referenced earlier now felt less like a detail and more like a central piece of infrastructure. Even the smallest objects in the room began to feel symbolic in a way no one had acknowledged before. A company-style access badge in a wallet, representing institutional connection rather than emotional assumption. A set of new house keys resting on the table, simple, metallic, but heavy with legal implication. Each object spoke the same language, recorded authority, not claimed authority. The white American billionaire man, late 50s to 70s, shifted his gaze across the table slowly. He did not react emotionally. Instead, there was a subtle recognition in his expression, the kind that appears when someone sees preparation rather than surprise. He understood immediately that this was not a reaction. This was a system that had been built in silence long before the courtroom ever opened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't explain. But his silence carried understanding. She had not arrived unprepared. She had arrived documented. Across the room, the opposing side still believed confidence would matter more than structure. They continued to read the situation as social positioning. Who looked stable, who sounded authoritative, who appeared more reasonable in front of a judge. But they had not yet processed the shift. The conversation was no longer about perception. It was about evidence density. The young woman remained composed, not because she was unaffected, but because she was already past the point of uncertainty. She wasn't reacting to what was being revealed. She was confirming what she had already known was there. And that is the difference most people miss in financial and legal conflict. People think power is expressed through volume. But real power is expressed through systems that continue working even when no one is speaking. The louder side still believed they were controlling the narrative. But control was already moving elsewhere, into documentation, timestamps, and structured records that do not require approval to exist. And just as the room began to adjust to what was on the table, something new shifted in. The background of the case, something external, institutional, and social, preparing to apply pressure from outside the courtroom itself. Because when evidence becomes visible, resistance does not disappear. It multiplies. Once the documents were visible on the table, the courtroom did not become calmer. It became more divided. Because evidence rarely unifies people immediately. Instead, it exposes where belief and loyalty were never aligned in the first place. The young white American woman, late 20s to mid-30s, could feel that shift in real time. Not in what was being said directly to her, but in how the atmosphere around her began to change shape. The same people who had looked at her earlier with doubt were now recalculating her role in the story. Not because she had spoken differently, but because the structure in front of them no longer supported the assumptions they had arrived with. And that is when pressure always begins. Not from facts, but from people trying to protect the version of reality they invested in emotionally. Her husband was no longer just arguing custody. He was now defending perception. The narrative that he was the stable one, the responsible one, the financial anchor, the one who handled everything. Around him, family members and social connections reinforced that image, subtly echoing the same framing. She was unstable. She was emotional. She was unpredictable. She was not aligned with what stability should look like in a legal setting. Even his legal team leaned into language that felt familiar in custody disputes, questioning her judgment, her consistency, her financial independence. Words designed less to prove truth and more to create doubt. Because in many family systems, especially when money is involved, the goal is not always accuracy. The goal is alignment. Who fits the image of responsibility? Who fits the expectation of control? Who looks like they belong in the position of authority? And that is where society becomes financially dangerous. Because people often pay to maintain acceptance they believe is fragile. They stay in homes they cannot sustainably afford just to avoid appearing unsuccessful. They absorb debt, quietly to preserve appearances in front of family. They accept financial arrangements that disadvantage them long-term simply to avoid being labeled as difficult, unstable, or selfish. In this courtroom, that same pressure was now being projected onto her. The suggestion was not just that she might lose custody. It was that she might be the kind of person who deserves to lose it based on perception alone. But perception is not documentation, and pressure is not proof. The white American billionaire man, late 50s to 70s, remained still through all of it. He observed the dynamic without reacting to the emotional layers being added by others. To him, this was not unusual. It was predictable. In systems involving money, family, and control, external pressure almost always increases when internal evidence becomes too strong to ignore. Because when documentation threatens a narrative, the narrative fights back socially before it loses legally. The young woman did not respond to the pressure theatrically. She did not need to. Her position was not built on how others interpreted her. It was built on what the system could verify. And systems do not respond to reputation. They respond to records. Still, the environment around her tightened. The case was no longer just legal. It was reputational, emotional, social. Every angle was being used to push her back into the role others had already assigned to her before seeing a single page of evidence. And yet, none of that changed what was already in the file. Not the deed, not the payment history, not the custody logs, not the school nurse documentation. All of it still existed, unchanged by opinion, which left only one question hanging in the space between pressure and proof. When social pressure rises, why do some people abandon systems, while others rely on them even more? The answer to that question was about to define everything that happened next. The moment the file was fully opened, the entire courtroom changed, not because someone spoke louder, but because the evidence finally stopped waiting to be ignored. The young white American woman, late 20s to mid-30s, remained still as pages of structured, Documentation were laid out in front of the judge. No emotion needed to be added. The system was already doing what it always does when activated properly, replacing interpretation with verification. The first section confirmed ownership structures. The deed was not ambiguous. It was not shared in the way people casually assume in relationships. It clearly defined who held legal title and under what conditions financial responsibility had been assigned. Names were not emotional here. They were contractual. Then came the financial records. Payment histories showed a consistent pattern that contradicted the narrative previously presented in court. Mortgage contributions, insurance payments, utility responsibilities. Each line item created a timeline that did not rely on memory, but on banking infrastructure. The question was no longer who said they paid. It was which account executed the transaction. Bank statements confirmed the flow of money with precision that no verbal argument could override. Transfers, schedules, and allocations created a structure of responsibility that was mathematically consistent over time. And then the prenup-style financial agreement appeared, quiet, formal, and absolute in language. It did not describe feelings. It described obligations, boundaries, and ownership definitions that were established before conflict ever existed. Finally, the custody-linked documentation, school records, medical logs, and the now central school nurse file was placed on top of everything else like the final layer of a system that had been quietly building for years. At that point, no one in the room needed to be told what was happening. Because documentation does not argue. It concludes. The opposing side attempted to reframe, to reinterpret, to reintroduce narrative through tone and implication. But every attempt sounded weaker against structured records that did not shift under pressure. The judge flipped through the file slowly, not because it was unclear, but because the density of information required acknowledgement rather than speed. Each page reinforced the same pattern. Responsibility was not where it had been described verbally. It was where it had been recorded consistently. The white American billionaire man, late 50s to 70s, finally spoke only once. Not to influence the outcome, but to clarify the principle underneath it. His voice was calm, measured, and without performance. You don't win financial or custody systems by speaking louder, he said quietly. You win by being the one the system has been recording all along. That sentence did not feel like commentary. It felt like translation. Because what the court had just witnessed was not an emotional victory. It was a structural correction. My husband's confidence, built on presentation and assumed authority, began to lose weight in real time as each document replaced a claim with a record. And in systems like this, claims do not survive contact with verified data. Silence returned to the room. But this time, it was not confusion. It was recognition. The school nurse file, once treated like a minor detail, had become the final missing piece that connected daily responsibility to legal reality. Not dramatic, not emotional, just decisive. And yet, even as the structure became clear, one final phase was already forming outside the courtroom's immediate attention, because legal outcomes always produce consequences that extend beyond the decision itself. Financial adjustments, custody restructuring, legal enforcement, responsibility realignment, all of which were about to follow, not as punishment, but as system correction. And what happened next would define not just who won the case, but how the reality underneath it would continue to unfold in ways no one could undo. By the time the court moved from evidence review to enforcement, the tone of the entire case had already shifted from argument to consequence. No one was debating emotions anymore. They were processing systems. The young white American woman, late 20s to mid-30s, sat quietly as her attorney confirmed what the documentation had already established. The deed was validated. The financial records were verified. The custody-related filings, including the school nurse file, were accepted into the official court record without dispute. Not because they were persuasive, but because they were consistent, structured, and legally complete. Her husband's legal team attempted final clarifications, but clarification no longer mattered. The bank had already verified transaction histories when requested. Payment records aligned with submitted statements. Insurance and mortgage responsibilities were cross-checked against account ownership and execution logs. What had once been framed as narrative was now processed as fact. The judge did not react emotionally. There was no visible shift of tone or sympathy. Instead, There was procedural acknowledgement, the kind that happens when a system stops evaluating claims and begins enforcing structure. Custody terms were reviewed based on documented responsibility distribution, not verbal assertion. Financial responsibilities tied to childcare and household obligations were reallocated according to recorded patterns, not assumed roles. Outside the courtroom, legal processes moved in parallel. Attorneys initiated the necessary filings to ensure that ownership records matched verified legal documentation. Where property access had been shared informally, it was now aligned strictly with title definitions. Where financial accounts had been loosely managed under assumptions, they were now corrected to reflect legal authority and documented responsibility. Bank institutions, when contacted for verification, confirmed the transaction histories without deviation. There was no ambiguity in their systems. Money had moved from specific accounts at specific times under specific authorizations, and those records did not adjust themselves to match emotional interpretations of fairness or contribution. Even small operational changes followed naturally. Access permissions were updated according to legal ownership structures. Administrative controls were reassigned based on documented authority. What people often call loss of control in these situations was, in reality, simply the system returning control to the structure it had always recognized on paper. Importantly, none of it required conflict. There was no escalation beyond procedure, no dramatic enforcement, just alignment. The white American billionaire man, late 50s to 70s, remained in the background of these transitions as a quiet observer of systemic correction. He had seen this pattern before. When documentation overrides narrative, the outcome rarely feels like victory or defeat. It feels like finality. Not emotional finality, but structural finality. And that distinction mattered. Because what most people misunderstand about financial and custody systems is that they do not reward emotion. They reward consistency. They reward documentation. They reward whoever can maintain alignment between responsibility and record long before conflict ever arrives. In the days that followed, the implications of the ruling began to settle into practical reality. Responsibilities were redistributed according to legal structure. Financial obligations tied to custody were recalculated. Access to shared systems was corrected. Nothing changed arbitrarily. Everything changed according to what had already been proven in court. And for the first time, clarity replaced assumption. The young woman did not frame it as victory. She did not need to. What mattered was not winning attention, but restoring accuracy. Because in systems like this, accuracy is the only form of stability that survives beyond conflict. There is a quiet checklist that emerges from cases like this, one that no one teaches emotionally, but everyone eventually learns structurally. Keep your documents organized before conflict begins. Understand whose name is actually on the title, not just who manages the payments. Track where money moves, not just who speaks about it. Protect accounts with clarity, not assumptions. Never trade financial control for social approval. And never let emotion replace written proof when structure is involved. Because in the end, systems do not remember feelings. They remember records. And what had once been a courtroom debate was now simply a documented outcome moving forward through legal and financial channels, exactly as the system had always intended. But even then, one deeper truth remained unspoken in the room. One that would define everything moving forward about how power, ownership, and identity were actually understood beneath the surface of law. And that truth was still waiting to be named. In the quiet aftermath of the courtroom's final procedural decisions, nothing about life changed suddenly, but everything changed structurally. There was no dramatic moment where the world shifted. Instead, there was a gradual settling, like dust finally finding the surface it was always meant to rest on. The young white American woman, late 20s to mid-30s, did not leave the experience transformed in the way people imagine transformation. She left it clarified, because what she had learned was not emotional resilience. It was financial and legal literacy under pressure. She now understood something most people only learn after losing control. Systems do not reward confidence, they reward documentation. Her reality was no longer interpreted through other people's opinions. It was anchored in records, ownership records, financial logs, custody documentation. School nurse files that once seemed insignificant but had quietly carried evidentiary weight when everything else became uncertain. The white American billionaire man, late 50s to 70s, remained an unchanged presence in the background of this entire experience. He had not intervened. He had not redirected the outcome. Instead, he had observed the same principle he always trusted, that money does not behave like emotion, and systems do not bend to narrative when documentation is complete. To him, what unfolded was not surprising. It was predictable, because in every system involving wealth, custody, and responsibility, the result always aligns with whoever is most consistently recorded, not whoever is most convincingly spoken for. And that is where identity begins to shift. Most people believe financial strength is about how you present yourself, how confidently you speak, how stable you appear, how much control you seem to project in moments of conflict. But real financial strength is quieter than that. It lives in ownership structures, in cash flow discipline, in legal names on titles, in the absence of ambiguity when systems are reviewed under pressure. The woman had learned, through experience rather than theory, that being financially secure is not about appearing powerful. It is about being structurally protected. It is about understanding where responsibility is recorded, how money actually moves, and what happens when emotional interpretation is removed from the equation entirely. And in that understanding, something important changed. She no longer measured her position by how others reacted to her, but by how systems recognized her. The billionaire's presence in her awareness was no longer just observational. It became symbolic of a mindset she now understood. Wealth that does not need to announce itself is often the wealth most aligned with reality. Quiet wealth does not argue. It does not perform. It simply exists within structure that holds under scrutiny. Her husband, once confident in narrative control, now existed in a different context entirely, one defined not by interpretation, but by documented limitation. The shift was not emotional. It was administrative. And that is often how financial truth actually changes lives, not through dramatic confrontation, but through corrected records and finalized structures. What remained after everything settled was not conflict, but clarity. And clarity is the most permanent form of financial awareness. Because when you strip everything back, arguments, assumptions, social pressure, even reputation, what remains is simple. Who owns what? Who moves money? Who is recorded as responsible? And who has maintained discipline long enough for those records to stay consistent over time? That is the identity shift most people never notice happening until it is too late. The lesson is not about winning arguments. It is about building systems that do not require arguments in the first place. It is about understanding that financial reality does not respond to emotion. It responds to structure, timing, and documented responsibility. The young woman no longer stood inside a story shaped by others. She stood inside a system that now reflected her reality accurately. And in that accuracy, there was stability, not loud, not performative, but quietly absolute. Because in the end, the difference between people who struggle financially and people who remain protected is not volume, confidence, or appearance. It is structure. It is ownership. It is documentation. It is discipline. It is the ability to remain calm while systems confirm what is real without needing permission from anyone's emotions. And that is the final truth this entire case revealed. Don't try to look powerful. Build a life where truth, assets, and evidence protect you silently, even when you say nothing at all.